Hey there! My name is Amethyst, and I have always loved Undertale and Deltarune. And with the release of Chapters 3 and 4, I felt inspired to make a handful of very detailed posters designated to each chapter of the game. These posters took me roughly a collective 50 hours to make, and so today I am going to break down exactly how I went about making each of these pieces while taking the time to show off the wonderful time-lapse footage I collected. Before we get into these discussions, I want to put out the world's biggest spoiler warning! I will be talking about anything and everything from the first 4 chapters of Deltarune. So, if you are not caught up, be warned, I am going to be spoiling things. I am going to be spoiling secrets, I'm going to be spoiling Easter eggs, I'm going to be spoiling plot twists and reveals and all of it. If you want to avoid spoilers, this is your time to back out, run away, get on out of here, because you don't want to watch this video. You have been warned, okay? Don't blame me. In the time after Deltarune's latest update and my recent return to my obsession with the series, I found myself diving back into a bunch of other indie titles, one of which being Celeste. The framing of Celeste's cover art ended up being a major inspiration for the piece, as I really liked the idea of Chris reaching out towards the soul. This became a focal point of the drawing and helped in shaping the rest of it. With Chris and the soul being at the center, I really wanted to connect Susie and Ralsei to them in some way to both put emphasis on them as major characters, but also to symbolize their collective reliance on Chris and by extension the soul to seal the fountains. In this poster, Ralsei is a little lower than Susie, bringing him a bit closer to the dark world below, symbolizing his connection to it. Additionally, one of Susie's eyes is uncovered in the piece in an attempt to reflect her arc from bad guy to hero and her character growth throughout the chapter. Now, with these posters, the goal had always been to capture as much of the chapter as I could in one piece. I wanted it to be an accurate reflection of what Chapter 1 had to offer, so I worked to include all the major areas in some way. This being the Field of Hopes and Dreams reflected in the grass, the Scarlet Forest being reflected in the trees, the checker pattern from the Great Board being reflected in the lead up to Card Castle, and Card Castle and the fountain looming at the end of it all. The most important part of it all was the characters. The characters and the enemies in Deltarune make it the emotional and entertaining game that it is, and so I wanted to make sure that I included every major character from this chapter. Now, for the purposes of my sanity, notable characters were all the enemies. There were a handful of non-fightable NPCs I did consider adding, but I struggled to find a way to meaningfully integrate them into the piece in some way, and so all the enemies plus the original Star Walker were included. All of them are in the air around the fountain, showing the idea of the fountain's power pulling these objects into the form of the Dark World. Along with this, I enjoy the spirit of secrets in these games quite a bit, and so I felt it most fitting to hide the chapter's secret boss Jevil amongst the scenery as a little Easter egg, just like he is in the game. Lastly, for Lancer and the Spade King, they were both drawn on the lower path facing each other. The king looms over Lancer with him standing before Card Castle, symbolizing their confrontation in the pacifist end of the chapter and the power dynamic between them throughout the chapter as a whole. Overall, Chapter 1 was a piece that felt very satisfying to do. The idea of a full poster for the first chapter had been something that I had been wanting to do since the game first came out, and so finally seeing it realized was a very good feeling. But this was only the beginning, and so with Chapter 1 finished, that brings us to... The Cyber World is one of my favorite dark worlds across the game, and Chapter 2 especially holds a very special place in my heart. When I was planning this out, I knew I wanted to incorporate the roller coaster tracks in some way, as that was one of my favorite moments from Chapter 2. Having all the main characters riding on the tracks felt like a very fun way to easily incorporate everyone, including Noelle and Birdley. For this piece, Susie's eyes are fully uncovered and her posing and expressions are a bit looser and more expressive, showing how by chapter 2 she's opened up about herself quite a bit. Ralsei is no longer shadowed by his hat, as by chapter 2 he has taken it off, something that is truly tragic, as I love drawing Ralsei with his hat on. Having the tracks as the base idea, I shaped the rest of the drawing around that concept as I worked. Having the cart tracks emerge from Queen's Mansion and then weave through the Cyber City, trying again to incorporate as many areas as I could. The flooring was colored as the Cyber Field as well, to help incorporate even more of the areas into a single piece. Similar to Chapter 1's piece, I tried to incorporate all the fightable characters along with the original Starwalker, and hid the secret boss twice in the background, as we were technically able to fight him in 2 different ways during 2 different runs. This isn't counting his original dumpster fight, but we're talking specifically like Spamton Neo. Along with the screens in the city, there were a handful of Easter eggs dotted around, including a Pippus, the Toby Fox car kill that leads to the egg, the Thorn Ring, and a Ralsei plush. Lastly, one of the things I liked the most about Chapter 1's piece was mimicking the game's coloring style and art style in certain sections. For Chapter 1, that was incorporated through the Scarlet Forest trees, and for Chapter 2, that was done using the city skyline behind Queen's Castle. piece that I am so very proud of. But it actually drove me a little insane to make. It sort of kicked off the trend of even-numbered chapters driving me up a wall, but we'll get back to that. The amount of detail and little bits that I put into this piece made it take nearly twice as long as Chapter 1, so I felt a little bit of relief when I got to move on to. Chapter 3 was an interesting challenge in its own right. Chapter 3 is a very long chapter gameplay-wise, but area-wise, when you really look at it, it's quite small. The section of the game only has 3 regular combat enemies, and most of the meat of the chapter took place during the physical challenges or video game sections. All this was a mix that definitely stumped me for a bit when I was thinking of how to format the drawing. I ended up using the game show stands as the focus for the drawing and tried to build more around that, using the red carpet sections from the TV overworld stretching behind the main 3 to help incorporate the enemies, NPCs, and mini-bosses of the chapters by making them the spectating crowds. Since there were so few enemies to pick from in the chapter, instead of just doing one of each enemy, I repeated a handful of the fightable enemies to help fill out the crowd a bit more, and mini-bosses and NPCs were scattered throughout them. I really wanted to incorporate the video game sections in some way since they were such a big part of the chapter, and so using the walls of screens seen around the overworld felt like a perfect way to do that. There are sections from each of the boards, physical challenges, a few extras and little hidden Easter eggs throughout, as well as the secret boss being hidden with both John Mantle and the Knight being on the screens. Lastly, we have the main 3, Susie, Chris, and Ralsei. Usually I build the drawing around them, but with this piece it was a bit more of the inverse. For Susie, I really wanted to maintain the more open and dynamic posing I started to introduce in Chapter 2, showing that continued growth and progression in her character. Ralsei, while a little more expressive in his posing, is meant to be a bit tighter in the way that he's posed, cheerful yet with an underlying tension and anxiety. Lastly, Chris's pose is meant to be their stance during the game sections and the boards of the level, kind of helping maintain that blank, everyman character vibe that's easy for the player to project onto. Behind it all was Tenna. I felt like compared to the other chapter bosses we've had thus far, he felt more present and involved with the chapter, and so he ended up getting a slightly more detailed figure compared to King or Queen in the previous chapters. I also really wanted to draw Tenna. He's looming over the rest of the chapter, showing his presence and the power he held over the TV world. Overall, Chapter 3 was quite a unique problem to tackle, and I think the way it came out was very fun. I love all the little bits I was able to slip into the piece and how unique the requirements of the chapter made it. Now with Chapter 3 done, only one remained. So, you remember when I said that bit about even number chapters driving me up a wall? Yeah, well, Chapter 4 was the main culprit for that. It posed a similar problem to the TV world about having many locations that aren't easily strung together, but on an even worse level, because this time I had to figure out how to bridge the dark world and the light world. I ran through a bunch of different ideas on how to handle this, but ended up making essentially 2 entire pieces for it. Most of what stuck out to me in the light world was the church and the holiday home, as they felt like they were the real big points of the chapter's opening. The problem is, these are also really fucking far from each other, because my torment is endless. I ended up making the choice to use the church as the focal point of the piece, this being to help more easily bridge the gap between the 2 sides of the poster. Now, using that did pose the problem of how to incorporate the holiday home, with it being such a big standout of the chapter, and again, really far away from the church. And believe me, if I had found a way to put Dessa's room in this poster, I 1000% would have, because the colors in that room are everything to me. But putting it in the background did feel like a good enough balance to strike. In the foreground, I wanted to incorporate a fair few characters from the Light World. Noelle played such a big role in the Light World section, so she was incorporated along with Rudy. And the scene between Toriel and Asgore outside the church cracked me up so much that I just had to add it in. Along with this, I wanted to incorporate some nods to the wider themes and mysteries of the chapter. Because I was focusing solely on the church, it was hard to get those wider shots around hometown, hitting all the different characters, and the overall composition of the piece made it hard to fit in more characters without it feeling cluttered or crowded. So my solution to this was papers swirling around that added some little nods. Within those papers, we have a missing poster for Des Holiday, Birdly on Noelle's phone, a page from The Lord of the Hammer, the church hymn that was also interpreted by one of my commenters as the freedom motif, which I think is a very fun interpretation and I'm totally down to roll with, the Deltarune, prophecy, and the letter Gerson has Susie write for Alvin at the end of the first sanctuary. Lastly, my favorite part of this was the stone path I added leading up to the church. Is there a stone path in the game? No, of course not. But it looked way cooler than grass, and it let me hide some little secrets, such as the Deltarune, and one I heard no one call out, being that Ralsei's shadow is present on the path, even on the Light World side of this piece, kind of showing how he is ever-presently with them, even with these kind of barriers between the worlds. Also, and this is a correction that was made later, but yes, I know Chris's shirt only has 1 stripe. I fixed it. I swear I actually know what the characters in this game look like. Oh my god. Now, the Dark World was fairly easy to tie into it all with the setup that I had done. For the Dark World, I wanted to make sure it felt distinctly different, yet perfectly intertwined with the Light World. So, the path and the church were directly copied over into the Dark World to more easily bridge that gap. Susie and Chris were also kept nearly the exact same, just with some outfit and color swaps to skin them into the Dark World. As for changes, Ralsei was added to the right side of Chris, where his shadow showed him in the Light World. The background was filled with columns and bookcases shown throughout the Dark World in Chapter 4, and the stone path was recolored to be more cool-toned. Now, another thing that I want to address here is the lack of characters. Believe me, if I could have added Jackenstein and Gerson, I absolutely would have. And I did spend some time trying to figure out how to incorporate them into the piece just through my own thinking. But in the end, it felt more important to signify that tone shift. And I felt like having less characters and almost making it feel a bit more empty lended itself better to the dramatic staging that I was trying to show off, and kind of helped show off that distinct tone change between Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Above all of it is the night, shown to be looming above the heroes the same way that they loomed over the heroes throughout the chapter. And behind the night is the final boss of Chapter 4, the Titan. The last big change to the Dark World side was the papers and leaves being swapped out for different pieces of the Shattered Prophecy. There's a bunch of different stuff in there, including Tenna, the Queen's Chariot, the Flower King, all of that good stuff, and I do recommend maybe looking around and trying to see if you can identify them all yourself. Finally, as for the little secret boss hide-and-go-seek Where's Waldo game we've been playing, Gerson's hammer can be seen on top of the piano. Behind it is the window with the hammered, and it is also depicted in one of the Shattered Prophecies. Again, I did want to try and find a way to incorporate Gerson as well, but with the way that it was staged and framed and the canvas size that I was making myself work with, this is what felt right to me. Is probably the piece that I am the most proud of. I put so much effort into it, and I think that you can see how much I improved over the set of 4 pieces in my backgrounds and my posing and my staging and the ability to incorporate these characters into actual environments. If you look back to even just a year ago, I was struggling to draw simple objects and backgrounds in a convincing way, to the point where I forced myself to spend the entire month of October just working on that. And so being able to look at these pieces and say, well, damn, these characters look like they're kind of in an environment that makes sense and in a place where they're supposed to be, and I don't hate the way I drew that tree. It's a nice feeling. It's a nice feeling to have. And with that, we reach the end. For now, at least. Deltarune still has 3 more chapters, and I've already committed myself to a poster set for Undertale, and possibly also Undertale Yellow, depending on how I'm feeling. So, if you enjoyed this video, if any of those future artworks sound interesting to you, or if my artwork at all seems interesting to you, consider subscribing. This channel is dedicated to showing off my artwork and my animations, so if either sounds interesting to you, it may just be worth your while. If you are looking for something else to watch, I have linked a playlist of all of my animations. They are some of my favorite works, and with us recently hitting over 2,000 subscribers, which I am so grateful for, you guys rock, I have plans to make a lot more animations, specifically something very long. So might as well take some time, get caught up on what I've done so far, and kind of see the improvement. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Have a fantastic day, week, month, year, life, all of it. Until I see you next.